Boa tarde. Para começar, vou me apresentar. Eu sou Walter Porto, sou editor de livros da Folha de São Paulo, colunista do Painel das Letras. E hoje eu tenho o prazer de conversar daqui da redação da Folha, em São Paulo, com o Adam Phillips, nosso convidado que fala diretamente de Londres. Phillips, que já está aqui com a gente, é professor visitante no Departamento de Inglês da Universidade de York e autor de um livro fascinante que acabou de ser publicado no Brasil pela editora Ubu, Sobre Desistir, com tradução do Breno Long. O livro foi publicado esse ano fora do Brasil, foi publicado no Reino Unido em janeiro e chegou ao Brasil poucos meses depois pela Ubu. E para todo mundo que está aqui, eu vou apresentar um pouco mais sobre o Adam Phillips para todos estarmos na mesma página. Phillips nasceu em Cardiff, no País de Gales. Ele é formado em letras pela Universidade de Oxford e é psicanalista há mais de 40 anos. Ele é membro da Royal Society of Literature e editor das traduções da obra de Freud, um autor que talvez um outro de vocês conheça, ao inglês para Penguin Modern Classics. O livro sobre Desistir é sua obra mais recente, mas ele é autor de mais de 20 livros que sempre costumam combinar psicanálise e crítica literária, alguns deles já editados no Brasil, como O Flerte, O que Você É e o que Você Quer Ser, e Winnicott, um estudo sobre outro dos seus autores de especialidade. Então, antes que vocês desistam de assistir, porque eu estou falando demais, a gente vai começar aqui a entrevista. Sr. Phillips, muito obrigado pela presença. Ficamos muito honrados de tê-lo aqui conosco hoje. Eu queria começar com uma pergunta para disparar a nossa conversa, uma pergunta talvez de nível quase pessoal sobre a sua autoria. Queria saber se houve alguma experiência concreta, seja sua própria ou de outra pessoa, que engatilhou essa vontade de pensar a importância da desistência.
Well, it's really impossible to know why one writes the books one writes in actuality. I am not temperamentally the kind of person who gives up. But I was aware of two fairly obvious things. One is that when people want to give things up, they believe they can change. And when they actually give up, they believe they can't. And it seemed to me that what people on the whole want to give up is self-destructiveness. That people give things up like alcohol or drugs or cigarettes or whatever. And these are things that they believe are harming themselves. So it's as though what we're always wanting to give up is our self-harm. And it's very interesting in and of itself that we are that preoccupied with our self-harm that we're so exercised by giving it up. So that interested me. I, of course, have known people and known of people who have killed themselves, but nobody close to me has done that. And I've also always thought that there was something terrible about people being as were forced to live if their life was a torment. So it seemed to me quite important that people were, I mean, in a way you might say, people could be taught in school about giving up, that it has many different connotations and it needn't be morally a negative thing to do. That we've all had the experience of staying in a relationship for too long, of an inability to give up certain people and certain things, or when pleasures have actually exhausted themselves, we're kind of loyal to those pleasures. So it seemed to me interesting, both educationally and emotionally, to think, well, why has giving up got such a bad press? And what may be the actual advantages to giving up? And why has it become the kind of cultural taboo that it has?
De fato, o livro argumenta mesmo que a desistência é uma espécie de tabu, mas uma coisa que o senhor fala mais para o final do livro, que me pareceu muito fascinante, é que toda a nossa cultura ela pode ser lida como uma construção para dominar as nossas perdas fundamentais e inescapáveis da vida. E que o ato de desistência, de certa forma, é uma maneira de a gente fazer isso por nós mesmos, a gente tomar uma voz ativa em relação a perdas que a gente vai ter de qualquer forma. Enquanto eu li o seu livro, eu me lembrei
Yeah,
muito da. daquele poema famoso da Elizabeth Bishop sobre a arte de perder, de que a perda é um aprendizado constante. E queria ouvir, então, que recomendações o senhor dá para esse aprendizado da perda?
Well, it seems to me we don't really need them because we're all losing all the time. You see what I mean? I mean, nobody's sitting here thinking, I'm getting older every second, but we are in fact getting older every second. So we're leading a kind of double life. So it would seem to me that it's impossible to conceive of a life without cumulative loss. The risk is, I think, being rather addicted to the idea of loss. And I think that's what the book is suspicious of or wary about. The way in which loss, or the elegiac, or whatever you would like to call it, becomes extremely compelling. And of course, being preoccupied by loss is also a way of protecting oneself from having lots of other thoughts. So at one point, I think I say in the book, it's always worth wondering when people are obsessed by loss, what that is a way of not thinking about. So I suppose I'm interested in the thing you mentioned, which is actually being able to orchestrate some losses. That loss isn't just something that we are the victim of, that just happened to us, but that actually we can choose to lose things and parts of ourselves and other people and so on. And that would seem to be a very important part of our freedom. The other point here, I think, which again is mentioned in the book, is that tragic heroes are people who never give up. And as a consequence of never giving up, they do a lot of destructive things. I mean, Trump never gives up. It would seem to me to be a characteristic of a certain kind of political mentality that they mustn't give up and they mustn't be seen to be giving up, as though that kind of vulnerability is a kind of indictment of character rather than a strength of character.
De fato, e eu gostaria de explorar um pouco mais sobre o comentário que o senhor fez sobre como os grandes heróis trágicos da literatura são pessoas que nunca desistem, e aí precisamente reside a tragédia desses personagens, né? Por que que esses personagens foram construídos assim, de forma a sobrevalorizar a insistência, uma certa teimosia nas narrativas clássicas?
Well, I think fundamentally it's a terror of dependence, a terror of an acknowledged need for other people. So you, as it were, cultivate a personality that is entirely self-sufficient. And therefore, you don't need interlocutors, you don't need conversation, you need accomplices and you need collusion. You need people who will, as it were, go along with you. And this is a fear of acknowledging that other people might have things one needs, and therefore one might be dependent on. So there's a fantasy, and I think it's mostly fantasy masculinity, but not only, of the self-sufficient, intractable, as it were, strong man or strong person, who, and the definition of strength here is self-sufficiency, self-reliance. And this would seem to me to be a very bad picture, that actually we should be learning to be as dependent as possible. That instead of the familiar life story, which is you begin very dependent, you become independent, and then you become dependent again, it should be becoming increasingly dependent as one gets older and older and older and older. And that means increasingly interdependent with other people. So acknowledging that actually one's life is only viable in relation with others, and that that's the point, not the problem.
Achei interessante que o senhor comentou agora que essa é uma característica ligada à masculinidade, é um comportamento do macho. O senhor pode explicar um pouco mais por que isso e como as mulheres lidam com essa postura?
Well, I can't talk authoritatively about women because I am not one, and I don't believe in my generalizations about women. I can talk a bit about men, and it seems to me intelligible in a psychoanalytic language that men often aspire to self-sufficiency because obviously one's initial experience is of being totally dependent on the mother. And one's got to bear the fact, or learn to bear the fact, that the woman who can satisfy you is also, by the same token, the woman who can frustrate you. And so it's not actually that men hate women, it's that men hate their need for women. But that issues in hatred of women. And so it would seem to me that having been that dependent on a woman as a baby and as a young child, part of oneself will want to do everything one can to avoid that experience again. Because with that dependence comes frustration, and with that frustration comes extreme rage. And these are all traumatic in different ways. So in a sense, you could think this macho personality that never gives up is fundamentally self-protective and has an acute sense of their own vulnerability. And reactive to this, they present themselves as very, 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 very strong. Well, no one is very, 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 very strong. Some people are in a sense stronger than others, but actually the best way of being strong is of being vulnerable. That would be my suggestion.
Falando sobre a literatura clássica, o senhor cita alguns dos personagens mais emblemáticos da literatura, desde personagens shakespearianos como Macbeth até personagens da Grécia antiga, né, dos clássicos gregos. Queria saber se o senhor diria que ainda existe essa valorização exacerbada da não desistência na cultura, ou se é algo que a gente herdou, mas que hoje é um pouco mais ralo.
Well, I hope that it's diminishing. But I mean, there are some distinctions need to be made here, which is that, for example, if you want to learn to play the piano, or you want to learn to be a sportsman or woman, you have to deal with a lot of frustration and resistance. And you can't learn something if you give up at the drop of a hat, you know, if you give up at the first frustration. So there are areas of one's life where giving up is a bad thing. It's just self-destructive. But there are other areas of one's life where giving up is a necessary thing. And the difficulty is making the distinction. Because in some areas, persistence and insistence and determination are very valuable. But in some areas, they're not. They're actually debilitating. So I think it's about distinguishing between different realms of experience, really.
Um dos aspectos da construção do tabu sobre a desistência, de fato, está associado a essa ideia de que desistir, qualquer passo na direção da desistência, leva a gente a pensar em ideias fatalistas, a renúncia absoluta ou ao suicídio, como o senhor trouxe no começo da nossa conversa, né? E isso inviabilizaria um pensamento mais brando, um pensamento mais suave sobre o ato da desistência. E eu fiquei pensando como modular isso.
Yes, but I think giving up at its most extreme is associated with suicide, which is something that everybody or most people are very, very frightened of. So it's as though there's a kind of slippery slope here. But the other thing I think that's embedded in this is the fear that one might realize that either one's life isn't worth living, or there's too much suffering in one's life. That actually there's something unbearable about the scale of suffering, or it's too frustrating. So the idea that one might come to the conclusion that life isn't worth living, I think is very disturbing to people. Now, this is partly the consequence of religion, because religions have worked very, 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 very hard to make us believe that actually life is a wonderful thing, in the full knowledge that life, for a lot of people and for everybody sometimes, is a terrible thing as well. And actually what one's life is like is as much to do with luck and character, so to speak, as it is about anything else. And so it's a very precarious project, being alive as a person in the world. And I think that, I mean, my, as it were, solution to this, there's no solution to this, but I do believe in education. And I believe that it's very useful to be given lots of examples in films and literature and songs and so on, of there being different approaches to this. So we have different examples that we can work with. So we're not only, for example, given a picture of people who are extremely resilient and can deal with every obstacle. You know, that doesn't seem to be a good model. It is sometimes, but it isn't always. And also, it would seem to me, we could be very skeptical of heroism altogether. There may be better ways of leading a good life. And I think certainly now we know more about more lives than ever before. And that is a useful thing, I think. So we haven't narrowed our mind to, as it were, 4 character types. We're very aware now there's a huge diversity of kinds of people. And I think that's better.
O senhor teria exemplos para citar de narrativas que valorizam a vulnerabilidade em vez da imponência, da insistência que a gente está criticando aqui?
Well, I think in some ways it's the difference between comedy and tragedy. I mean, tragic heroes are affect to be invulnerable, and they create huge amounts of destruction to other people and themselves. Comic characters are acknowledging and, as it were, boasting about their vulnerability. And they don't tend to come to terrible ends, and they actually tend to be exemplary in terms of sociability. So they make a world that is more appealing, at least to me, to live in than a tragic hero who basically creates a wasteland around himself. It's a choice between different stories about life.
O senhor está defendendo, então, que a comédia deve ser mais incorporada nas escolas?
Oh, yes, definitely. I mean, there should be more laughs, for sure. People should go to school to make friends, fundamentally, and to learn sociability. and then to find out if there is anything that is of interest to them. But the medium should be enjoyment, in my view. The ethos shouldn't be something is valuable because you have to suffer in order to get it. That seems to me silly. I mean, some things require suffering, but some things don't. Some things are easy, some things are difficult. But we don't have to assume that the valuable thing is the thing you earn by suffering. So those would be the kind of ideas I think that I'd be interested in, but certainly that the medium of education would be enjoyment. Because I remember my eldest daughter, I once went to her school to get a report, and the teacher said, the trouble with Mia is she only works at subjects she's interested in. And I thought, good. What else should she be doing?
Tá certo. E isso me leva a uma outra questão que me ocorreu enquanto eu li o seu livro, porque ele me parece, o percurso que ele faz tem muito menos a ver com desistência e com o lado negativo do que com uma exploração do desejo e das vontades humanas. Por que que o senhor construiu esse livro dessa forma?
Well, I think I'm temperamentally more interested in possibility and opportunity than I am in defeatedness and determinism. And if you're a psychoanalyst, and if you train to be a psychoanalyst, and if you are interested and learn a lot of the theory, which I am and was, it's a very, very, at some levels, it's a very impoverished picture of a life and of what a person is, because it basically says that we are terrified of ourselves and of other people. And so resistance is the name of the game. We resist our own desire and we resist relationships with other people. So I think what I have always been interested in is a more pleasurable and enjoyable version of psychoanalysis. When I was training to be an analyst, the assumption was that life was kind of a vale of tears, and the really deep people were the people who suffered a great deal. And I was temperamentally not depressed, if you see what I mean. I wasn't happy all the time, but I was basically in good spirits. And I was treated, fortunately I was young, so I got away with it, but I was treated as the fact that I was in good spirits a lot meant that I was a very, very shallow person who couldn't deal with the difficulties of life. Now, this is obviously ridiculous, but on the other hand, you know, you can see what they meant, so to speak. But I wanted psychoanalysis to be a mixture of the Bloomsbury Group and Woodstock, that people would be genuinely interested in free speech, and they would be genuinely interested in enjoying each other's company. They would have different ideas about the police. And what I found was, with some very wonderful exceptions, a profession of very serious, very earnest, very sentimental, and rather depressed adults who were engaging with what they thought of as the depths. And it seems to me they were their idea of the depths. Because what's very easy to forget is that when psychoanalysts give you their concept of cure, these are prescriptions masquerading as descriptions. They're actually telling you what they think a good life is. But they don't put it like this. They say, this is what life is really like. And this is spurious, because the question is always is, you know, do you want what Lacan wants you to want? And if so, why? You know, are you merely, as it were, joining the psychoanalytic army, or can you use psychoanalysis to develop something of your own? Well, I wanted to write not an upbeat book, because that would be silly, but I certainly wanted to write an undepressed, undefeated, and not excessively anxious book about psychoanalysis, which for me is a romance. It's not a tragedy, it's a romance. And it's a kind of quest romance. And that's what I'm interested in.
A fala do senhor me lembra uma entrevista que eu fiz recentemente com uma crítica literária, e ela me falou que durante muito tempo, hoje ela enxerga que ela perdeu muito tempo durante a vida dela performando uma imagem séria, sisuda, porque ela achava que assim ela seria vista como uma pessoa inteligente. Então, acho que fala muito sobre essa
Yeah,
performance da inteligência, da genialidade, que tem a ver com ser carrancudo também, né?
yeah, yeah. And enacting the idea of being a deep and serious person. You know, at any given moment in a psychoanalytic treatment, the question isn't, am I doing psychoanalysis properly? The question is, what kind of person do I want to be? Do I, at this moment, want to be the kind of person who doesn't answer the patient's questions, say, or who doesn't offer the patient a cup of tea, or whatever it is. It's about that. And psychoanalysis is a vocabulary. Anybody who goes to see a psychoanalyst walks into a vocabulary. And it's inevitable, but they need to know that. And I think they need to know the consequences of this. Because the risk is, and I'm not the first person to say this, is that it's sometimes staged as though the analyst always already knows what the patient is talking about. And of course, this is absurd. I mean, there's no way you can be an expert on the unconscious. It's either unconscious or it isn't. So there's that. There's also the problem of relationship, so that, and this happens a lot in analysis, I might think I'm a very kind person, but what I don't do is find out what it would be from the other person's point of view for me to be kind to them. That makes all the difference. So for me, psychoanalysis is much more a curiosity profession than a helping profession. In other words, it facilitates and enables people's capacity to speak and to hear what they have to say. And with no known destination, obviously, one wants to alleviate people's suffering. And sometimes that happens, but it may not always be the best thing to do. It may be more important to have for one to feel that one's life is real to oneself, or one is able to be the best version of oneself, or one's able to have a conversation in which one might work out, in my case, what kind of man I want to be.
A minha próxima pergunta, na verdade, é puxando um pouco mais por esse gancho do trabalho psicanalítico, ligando com a questão da desistência. O senhor diria que faz parte do trabalho do psicanalista, de alguma forma, fazer o seu paciente entender que ele pode desistir de vez em quando e facilitar essa decisão para ele?
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's partly about working out what one's unconscious aims and ambitions and desires are. And that involves partly giving up, but it also might mean discovering what one's unconscious repertoire is of attractive risks. There are all sorts of risks that one has either not acknowledged or been unable to take. And one needs to know about these things, I think, because it's a clue about one's pleasure. So I think that's another bit of it. I wouldn't want to get into a sort of habit, as it were, of thinking, like an awful lot of world religions, that psychoanalysis is about learning how to give things up. It may be about learning to give certain things up. It also might be about A, not knowing what one wants, and B, experimenting with one's wants. So wants are experiments in living rather than already known agendas. And so you could then think, you don't have relationships to get your needs met. You have relationships to find out what your needs might be.
Isso me lembra uma outra passagem do livro que eu achei bastante inspirada na maneira como o senhor resume, que é falando sobre as perdas, né? Que elas podem ser vistas como fonte de inspiração, mas isso não quer dizer que elas devem ser encobertas por um verniz positivo. Não devem ser entendidas como positivas, mas podem ser inspiração. Se o senhor puder esclarecer um pouco mais essa distinção.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that I'm interested in is the possibility that in some situations, loss can be a kind of stage fright. That the question is, what is it possible for me to be or become or to want in the light of losing somebody or losing something? So it precipitates you into an experimental, different kind of life in the absence of what or whoever's been given up. So I don't want to minimize the power of catastrophic loss or minimize the significance of mourning. But I don't think mourning is the realest thing we ever do. And I don't think mourning, I think depth doesn't matter, but I don't think mourning is always the most interesting thing that we do. It is sometimes, but not always. And so I suppose it's a question of temperament, partly, which is to wonder, if loss isn't catastrophic, what else might it be? And clearly, in Freud's developmental theory, and not only his developmental theory, it's all about the capacity to transform loss into growth. So it's not about, it isn't for some people, but it's not about learning to mourn, it's about learning to develop, actually. And learning to develop means being able to transform losses into development. And that seems to me to be a better game.
Um outro aspecto do livro que me parece contraintuitivo, mas em direção ao final dos seus ensaios, é um quase elogio da censura que o senhor coloca de forma quase, me parece até um pouco provocativa, afirmando que a censura é algo que pode trabalhar também em favor do desejo. Se o senhor puder explicar um pouco melhor também como isso se relaciona à discussão que a gente vem tendo até agora.
Yes, I mean, obviously it is a kind of provocation, but it doesn't make it any less significant, so to speak. It seems to me the point here is that there are two things. One is, of course, really powerful censorship is not experienced as censorship. We don't know we're being censored. And that, of course, is disturbing and interesting in itself. That really successful censorship is invisible. It doesn't look like censorship. So that's one bit. The other bit here, I think, is that in, say, Freud's picture of the mind, but there are other pictures here, it is as though there's an unacceptable desire that has to be made sufficiently acceptable to be viable, to be lived out. So what the censor does is the censor at his best renders something unacceptable or forbidden or dangerous into more acceptable form, such that it can then be acknowledged. So the censor enables us. It's like it's not alchemy exactly, but it's like in a way it's like an artistic transformation of rendering something difficult or troubling or disturbing or dangerous as being in a form that makes it available for us to be interested in it and curious about it. So censorship isn't simply shutting people up. It also might be about enabling people to speak. That's my suggestion.
E o senhor traz aquela ideia famosa e como o senhor mesmo classifica, quase escandalosa de Freud, de que a censura, como é que é? Tolher a censura, como é que é? Censurar o prazer, desculpa, é tão difícil às vezes quanto censurar o sofrimento. Se o senhor puder falar um pouco mais sobre isso, porque acho que tem a ver com essa ideia de a censura como algo que modela os sentimentos e as emoções, né?
Yes, exactly. In a way, it acculturates them. That it's through censorship that one is acculturated, that one learns to live in a culture. Because the censor is, if you like, is embodying the principles and standards and forms of acceptability that enable one to be part of the culture. So education is censorship, fundamentally. And obviously, it's more or less severe, more or less cruel, more or less bullying. So that it would be, I think what I'm promoting here is the idea of finding really useful, appealing, attractive forms of censorship.
Acho que é importante falar para quem está ouvindo que ele não está falando de censura estatal e nem de permitir que o governo diga o que as pessoas estão falando, mas uma autocensura, uma censura interna, quase. Mas falando nisso, Sr. Phillips, na entrevista que o senhor deu a uma colega minha aqui da Folha de São Paulo, há alguns meses, o senhor comentou que essa ideia de nunca desistir é fascista, tem uma ligação com o fascismo. E isso acabou sendo alçado ali ao título da reportagem e chamou bastante atenção. Eu gostaria que o senhor explicasse um pouco melhor o que quer dizer com essa afirmação.
Well, that fascism is an omniscient state of mind. If you like, it's the assumption that I know the truth, I know what's right, I know how we should live, I know what we should do. And not only that, but I need everybody else to believe it as well. I mean, Winnicott, psychoanalyst, said madness is the need to be believed. Well, the fascist needs accomplices, not critics. The fascist actually is engaged in the project of narrowing everybody's mind to make sure that people can't have dissident, contrary thoughts. So it would seem to me that in order to be a fascist, so to speak, you have to find a way of evacuating self-doubt. You have to find a way of radically narrowing your mind. You have to make sure you're surrounded by people who agree with you, who consent. And then it seems to me you're as it were onto something. I mean, you're onto something mad, but you're onto something. But this depends upon giving up sociability. You give up sociability for a world of accomplices. There's no exchange, there's simply collusion.
E não há espaço para vulnerabilidade também, que a desistência
That's right.
pressupõe.
Yes, exactly. And if you give up, you, as it were, hand yourself over to other people. It's a part of it is a state of being looked after. Well, one of the fundamental questions is, what was your mother like when you were ill?
É, e boa parte das reflexões do livro, elas se ambientam justamente na época da ascensão do nazifascismo, né? Também porque o senhor fala muito sobre o trabalho de Freud, fala muito sobre a literatura de Kafka, que era uma época de muita desilusão, uma visão catastrofista estava dominando o mundo. Se o senhor puder falar um pouco mais de como esse momento histórico ali da instauração do nazifascismo se relaciona a essas ideias que o senhor procura explorar.
Well, psychoanalysis is a period piece. It's of its time, as everything is. And so it's not incidental that Freud produces a picture of a human subject that is fundamentally paranoid, that is under threat from the internal world, under threat from the external world, under threat from the superego. Well, Freud was living at a time, as we all know, when he and a lot of his fellow Viennese Jews, not only Jews, were under a great deal of threat. They were living in an extremely dangerous world, and it was not clear where the reliability or the safety was. So it's not an incidental picture of a human subject. Similarly, in a different way, Kafka is very, very, very preoccupied by rules and laws and standards, and he's living in a very policed state. And so he's wondering, well, what effect is this having on me, on us? How are we rule bound, and what are we doing with this rule boundness? So I think these are ostensibly they're fictional accounts that are partly about, as it were, people's internal worlds, but by the same token, they're about the external world as well. They're political allegories as well as subjective accounts. And after all, here are two cataclysmic Second World Wars, First and Second World Wars, and the Holocaust. So oddly enough, Freud is absolutely obsessed by human destructiveness and is really struggling, as is Kafka in a different way, to find a good reason to go on living. Because once you lose religious belief and you are in that kind of cataclysmic destruction, the question is, what is the point of suffering? Why is it worth doing? What could it possibly mean? It could show you that actually life is insufferable. It entails too much suffering. So really, these are attempts not to despair, or to find ways in which one doesn't need to despair in order to go on living.
Eu já vou começar a fazer perguntas que estão chegando do público, então eu estimulo quem está ouvindo a gente se tiver alguma questão, escrever aí na caixa de comentários. Mas eu vou fazer uma última antes, que é para avançar um pouco mais nesse assunto da última pergunta. Queria ouvir de forma ampla se as condições em que o mundo está, o contexto mundial, o contexto do seu país, o lugar que você ocupa no mundo, a sua sociabilidade, afetam então a sua relação com o desejo, afetam a relação do indivíduo com o desejo. Você viver numa época mais escura, numa época mais amedrontadora, produz um indivíduo também que tem uma relação mais conflituosa com o próprio desejo. Faz sentido isso que eu estou falando?
Yes, totally. I mean, desire is fundamentally a belief in the future. And when the future looks hopeless or foreclosed or dispiriting, it's going to be very, very difficult to desire. And yet, without desire, life isn't worth living. So we're in a bind here, which is the only thing that sustains us is our desire and the possibility of some satisfaction. And yet we're living in a political world increasingly where it looks very much as though there's going to be very little satisfaction and a great deal of hatred. And so it would seem to me, on the one hand, how does one go on believing in desire and appetite, but also how does one go on believing in love? Because it looks very much as though hate is much stronger than love. And that's always been the secondary question for the individual and for society, which is, what happens when hate is stronger than love?
Vou começar então a fazer perguntas que vieram do nosso público. Primeiro, uma da Toya Lort, que é o seguinte: eu entendo que ela é psicanalista ou trabalha de alguma forma com isso. Ela pergunta: como podemos ajudar os pacientes a fazer uma distinção entre quando é produtivo e saudável desistir e quando é produtivo e saudável não desistir? Acho isso difícil porque os ganhos geralmente ocorrem a médio e longo prazo, ela diz.
Well, there could never be a rule or a method or a system that would answer that question. So it would seem to me, and again, this seems to be integral to psychoanalysis, which is something is explored rather than concluded. So each issue would have to be explored on its own terms, and then choices would be made. And choices are exclusionary. They're a risk. They don't come with guarantees. And that also is the point. So there could be no method here, but what psychoanalysis does offer is the time and the space to explore and freely talk about what the options are and how they might matter and what the consequences may be. But what psychoanalysis can't do is preempt the necessity of choice, nor should it try to.
Vou seguir com uma pergunta da Marli Assis. Ela diz: a história nos apresenta um número elevado de intelectuais que desistiram da vida e se suicidaram, muitos deles ligados à arte. Como podemos entender esse contrassenso entre ter o dom da criatividade e o ato de desistir?
Well, I think we have to consider the real possibility that a really profound, intelligent, imaginative engagement with living a life reveals that it is unbearable to live life. I don't mean this is the truth. I just mean this is one of the possible truths. So it doesn't seem to me at all a contradiction that, as it were, very intelligent, very creative people should kill themselves, because it would seem to me that's got to be one possibility. Just as it would seem to me, in a way, odd to live a life in which one has never considered suicide.
Agora, enfim, fazer um comentário meu. Eu fiz recentemente uma reportagem justamente sobre isso, sobre a relação entre artistas, escritores e suicídio ou distúrbios de saúde mental. E uma das coisas que surgiram na reportagem foi a ideia de que o artista é uma pessoa que está dedicada a desmontar tudo que a gente conhece, a desconstruir a maneira como a gente vive a vida, e às vezes esse mergulho tão profundo no que há de mais basilar na vida acaba fazendo com que cheguem a uma posição quase nihilista de que a vida não faz mais sentido para
Yeah,
eles.
yeah, yeah. And we could take that the people we call artists are people who are excessively receptive to the complexity of the currents in our lives. And for some people, this will be overwhelming. For some people, it will be unbearably painful. And for some people, it might be exhilarating as well. But there's no inevitable conclusion to that kind of curiosity.
Agora eu vou fazer uma pergunta da Helena Fontes. O Brasil teve recentemente uma grande tragédia na região sul, com chuvas em excesso que acabaram levando a enchentes, enfim, um grande desastre climático que aconteceu no sul do país. Muitas pessoas perderam tudo, perderam suas casas, perderam seus pertences, e a pergunta se relaciona a como essas pessoas podem achar um caminho de esperança, como levantar desse tombo. Sobretudo os idosos, ela pergunta.
Well, there couldn't be a generalized answer to that question. Nor could there be any discipline, method, again, or system that would enable people to answer that question. But it would seem to me, in the face of catastrophic loss, what people are confronted with are ultimately what the nature of their own resources are and what kind of hope they have. So it seems to me we're not able to teach people to go on living. And we have to acknowledge the fact that for some people, their lives have been ruined. There is no point for them to go on living. But those people who survive and make something of it, it'll be to do with their own histories, their own genetic makeup, their own personalities. But there isn't going to be a form of therapy, I believe, that's going to make these people's lives viable. Because everybody knows, and everybody has always known, that anything can happen to anybody. That's just the nature of living a life. And we are, after all, natural creatures living in a natural environment. And that natural environment is both prone intermittently to disaster, but also we are actively destroying our own environment. There it is. Now, it seems to me it becomes, in a way, it's the wrong way round. How are we going to help people survive the consequences of climate change? Well, that's a real issue. But the real issue is, what are we going to do about the ongoing climate catastrophe? Or if there's anything that can be done.
Pois é. O senhor comentou numa pergunta, numa resposta recente sobre como hoje o mundo talvez pareça ter mais ódio do que amor, e tem duas perguntas aqui que falam sobre redes sociais, que acho que são vitrines desse ódio que a gente tem visto hoje, né? Uma pergunta do Guilherme, eu vou fazer duas perguntas seguidas, tá? Uma pergunta do Guilherme fala de forma mais geral se as redes sociais ajudam ou atrapalham na decisão sobre o ato de desistir. E uma segunda pergunta do Paulo diz assim: nessa época de redes sociais, nas quais tantas pessoas se preocupam em se apresentar como modelos de qualidades bem aceitas e esconder seus defeitos e desistências, podemos estar reforçando uma cultura de falsos vencedores?
Well, I think there are two things here. One is I'm not on social media and have never been on social media. But of course, I know an awful lot of people who are. It would seem to me that on the one hand, you could think, and there are lots of very obvious reservations and misgivings about virtual reality and about the fantasy, about the nature of relationships that are virtual. But the other thing I'm slightly more wary of is that people have always complained about the new generation. People have always complained about new things. And you might think, in evolutionary terms, we're going to have and produce different kinds of people now. And it'll be interesting to see what they're like. Because I'm sure we've all had the experience that our parents thought all the new inventions were terrible, or most of them were. So I think we maybe shouldn't jump on the bandwagon and assume we know the effects. There are things about these media that I personally don't like, that lots of people don't like. But it seems to me, like capitalism itself, which is obviously a function of, there's something unstoppable. I mean, Slavoj Žižek said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And that seems to me to be right.
E o senhor mencionou falou brevemente, né, sobre a questão das mudanças climáticas, que também talvez anuncie uma nova era de preocupação, uma nova era sombria da humanidade, né, porque a gente vai ter que lidar com desastres cada vez mais frequentes e um mundo que lida também com a possibilidade real de cataclisma, né? Isso o senhor diria que vai afetar a maneira como os indivíduos se relacionam, como a gente estava falando, com os próprios desejos, com a própria ideia de futuro e de esperança?
Well, it'll have a huge impact in lots of different idiosyncratic ways. But as, say, Darwinians, our assumption will be that the people who adapt, are able to adapt, will be the ones who will survive and reproduce. The problem is that the qualities of the people who adapt may not be qualities that all of us admire. In other words, the people who make a success of this catastrophe may be, some people's point of view, the worst people. So I think there is really no reason for simple optimism here, which doesn't mean that in our small local individual lives we can't behave well and treat people properly.
A Gabriela pergunta sobre que ela diz, na verdade, que ela queria entender melhor a relação entre desistência e solidão. Diz ela, normalmente associamos solidão com independência, mas parece que a decisão de desistir é ao mesmo tempo solitária e um reconhecimento da nossa dependência. Como essa noção de desistência reconfigura o entendimento do que é estar sozinho?
Well, I think the risk is that giving up might involve giving up on human relationships. You might think people withdraw out of persecution or out of the wish for the nourishment of solitude. But if one's aloneness is a refuge from relationships in the world, it's going to be unnourishing, it would seem to me. So that I think the risk is people ending up believing that one can only viably live a life by oneself. And that would seem to me the death of hope, really. So in my preferred world, people would be able to move between being by themselves and being sociable. And it wouldn't be one at the exclusion of the other, but they would be able to, as they say, enjoy their own company, but also enjoy the company of others. And neither would be a refuge from the other.
A Ana Lúcia também pergunta se podemos pensar na concepção do brincar de Winnicott, também na clínica com adultos, como estratégia para acolher a vulnerabilidade e viabilizar saídas, como a desistência.
Yes, I mean, I think the point about playing is that it's not about winning and losing. It's about people doing things together that feel both enjoyable and inventive. So that in playing, one forgets oneself, one loses oneself. And it would seem to me the aim of psychoanalysis would be for people to be able to forget about themselves. When people are anxious or depressed or whatever, they're self-obsessed. They have to be. So the question is, how can you forget yourself and be absorbed in other people and other things? Well, playing at its best is a form of absorption. There are lots of other ones, but I think that's where it begins with children. And the other thing about playing is that it's free-flowing, ideally. So it's not over-contained and it's not overly rule-bound. Of course, there are games with rules, but there are games without rules. You know, if you want to play soccer, you have to learn the rules. If you want to play in a free way, there are no rules to learn. You just see what happens between 2 or 3 or 4 people. And it would seem to me that that's very much, for me, a picture of what might be psychoanalysis at its best, which is it's without authority, but it's an unintimidating relationship in which people are free to have their own thoughts and feelings and desires and experiment with their articulation.
Vou fazer uma última pergunta que chegou também, a gente já está chegando ao final do nosso encontro. Na verdade, são perguntas de pessoas que parecem já conhecer mais profundamente a sua obra, Sr. Phillips. Primeiro, a Irene pergunta como você articula as ideias de missing out e sobre desistir. E diz que os livros pareceram a ela muito, muito íntimos.
I think probably all the books are connected, not in ways that I necessarily can discern, but I'm sure that's true. I think the thing about missing out is, I mean, there are a lot of things. I mean, the trouble is, the book is its sentences. It's not something that I can paraphrase. It's not written with ideas, it's written with sentences. And that's why I can't just, as it were, reproduce it. But ask the question, what immediately comes to mind is the idea that missing out is about experiences one doesn't have and their place in one's life. And giving up is about deciding not to have experiences and taking the consequences of that. So that seems to me to be the most self-evident link. But it's really fundamentally about absence, about what one can make of absence.
E uma outra pergunta da Toya, que também já fez uma pergunta hoje. Na verdade, ela também queria saber como se liga o missing out e o sobre desistir, o que me parece um incentivo para as editoras, talvez a própria Obu, publicarem o missing out, porque parece que é um livro que se complementa de alguma forma às ideias do sobre desistir, não?
Yes, I mean, I'd be very happy if it was published in Brazil.
Sr. Phillips, eu queria agradecer muito pela conversa, pela presença do senhor aqui hoje. Foi um prazer conversar com o senhor e queria agradecer a todo mundo que ouviu, que acompanhou, que fez perguntas. Muito obrigado a todos e todas.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Thank you.